So it is my hope to speak very little tonight and to have people have many of their questions answered. We have the elected officials, and I think maybe the best way to do it is when I say which entity you're from, be it a Washtenaw County Commissioner or Scioto Township, or you raise your hand. So people know where you are. I'm going to do that part first, then I'll lay a little groundwork. So we have the Mayor of Ann Arbor, Chris Taylor, and the City Council members of Ann Arbor. Their hands are up. They're not even sitting together. Mike Moran from Ann Arbor Township and his partners in crime. I guess I shouldn't use that word. Washtenaw County Commissioners, Jason Morgan Chair, and the Commissioners, and Scioto Township. Everybody's down there. So you know where they're from. So I want to just set a tone for tonight. And I've spent a lot of time on the phone with everybody that's at this table and a lot of other people that have been working on this. So I want to thank everybody for being here. EPA is to my right, the Attorney General's office, who's going to try to keep us out of trouble. But maybe I want to get in some trouble. No, I'm only, actually I do. And Eagle is on this side, and they'll introduce themselves when they speak. But we're here because we've known about a dioxane plume in Washtenaw County. Not we, I didn't. I wasn't even here when it was first discovered, almost 40 years ago. I have been in Congress, believe it or not, this month. It has been 5 years. And the first, but the first 4 years I went to meetings and heard a lot of people who were very intense talk at each other and talk past each other. And in discussions with the EPA and EGLE, the differences between communities, the different intensity, the different passions was, some people had petitioned to have a Superfund site designated. Other people were working, well now we're in court working on a consent decree, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'm not. I don't know. I'm like most of the community members here. I have no idea. That's why the AG's office is going to keep me out of trouble. But the tension between all the communities, quite frankly, was becoming a problem in terms of ultimately getting this resolved. So, and I would have discussions with EPA and EGLE, and at our request, I mean, I did ask it, but I did it on behalf of all of you. We had asked EPA to do a preliminary assessment, and they did a preliminary assessment, which Mike will talk about a little tonight. They told us a year ago that unless the governor asked EPA to intervene or come in, that they were going to step back from the project. And a lot of people were upset about that. Other people weren't upset about that. And I said to everybody at that time, you all need to come together. So we brought everybody you're seeing in this front row together to try to figure out what was the right way to go. Now, there is work going on in the AG's office, can talk about that, because there had been a consent agreement which has had to be revised because of a change of the standard. And some people here are parties to that consent decree, some are not. Two of us right here, I'm looking right at Mike, are not parties, so we don't know what's happening. We don't know, so it's very hard. And that's part of the problem, which I've discussed with everybody up here. This side, the EPA side, has nothing to do with it. I'm not even going to make jokes tonight, but the AG's office and Eagle's office is there, but they too, I mean, Lisa, who's the head of Eagle, who's very engaged and very focused on this project, said part of our problem is there's no transparency. Community members don't know what is happening, and they're worried, and that's a problem. But then everybody keeps asking me questions about what would EPA do? If we ask EPA to come in, would they even say this was a site? Would they designate it? And I don't want to translate. I don't want to translate from EPA. I don't want to translate from EGLE. And I certainly am not going to translate for the Attorney General's office. I'm not a lawyer. But so I thought it was important to have everybody here. We've done this before, but tonight we're going to do it with all of the elected officials here, which has not been the case. And we're going to do it well, we can have emotion. I'm not exactly an emotional person, but we got to do it respectfully. That's part of my problem in the world today, is that we're not treating each other with respect. We're going to really ask you not to get up and give a monologue. We want to answer questions. So we'll have people, the elected officials, obviously, because they've got to make decisions. But people in the audience, we'll bring a mic to you, and we want to make sure we're answering those questions. And then after everybody has the information, the elected officials have to go back and talk to each other. I think I have the commitment of, I know, Lisa really wants to work to make this as transparent as possible as soon as she can. And I think what has to happen is that the four communities need to come together and be united and try to figure out the path forward and improve communication with the community about what the status is and what everybody needs to agree on. What are we trying to accomplish? What is the goal of all four communities to clean up this plume? And then agree on the path that'll have measurable milestones, and people will be held, who's ever got the responsibility, to what's the path that's agreed to. So, I hope that sets the groundwork, and with that, I'm going to turn to Mike Neller first from EGLE, who is the Remediation and Redevelopment Division's Director from EGLE. I'm going to ask everybody here who has any preconceived notions. Mike is bringing a fresh perspective, a new perspective to this. He's only been with EGLE for 2 years. He's studying this, and he's really trying to understand and answer your questions. So I turn this over to you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. First of all, I want to thank you for putting this together. Like the Congresswoman said, my name is Mike Neller. I'm the Division Director. Can you hear it? Sorry. How about now? Is that better? Better. All right, I'll start over. First of all, I just want to thank Congresswoman Dingell for putting this together. And like she said, I am the Division Director for RRD, Remediation and Redevelopment Division at EGLE. I've been serving in that position for 5 weeks now. So
it's a fresh perspective.
So I brought with me members of the RRD staff. I have Jerry Turnin, who's the district supervisor, and then Dan Hamill, who's the project manager for the remediation project that's going on that we're talking about. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the comments and the discussion. These guys to my left have tried to educate me on the project and some of the other legal aspects of this, but I thought it was really important for me to come here and hear it face-to-face, in person, because that really is different than a bunch of emails or other comments. So again, thanks for coming, and I'll relinquish the microphone.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you, Mike. Now I'm going to turn it over to Michael Burkhoff, who most of you know. His formal title is Remedial Project Manager, Region 5 from the EPA, who spent a lot of time with all of you for a year, and I thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Dingell, for having us here. Thank you all for coming out to this meeting and to past meetings. It's been a pleasure to get to know many of you, and I thank you for your participation in this process. To my left is Joan Tanaka. She's the Acting Deputy Division Director for the Superfund Program in Region 5. We're here to answer your questions about the Superfund process, and we look forward to doing so.
You're being really short. So we'll have a good long Q&A. I talked about Brian earlier, who is the Assistant Attorney General from the Attorney General's Office. And besides warning, you should talk about the parameters of tonight's discussion, and welcome.
Hi, Brian Nagel, Assistant AG. Many of you know me. I've been working on this case for, it feels like forever, but it really hasn't been that long. Hopefully you can hear me well enough. Over the at least maybe 4 or 5 years I've been involved in this case, I've really come to appreciate the passionate persistence of the local people that have been involved. I've been attending CARD meetings quarterly. I've attended all of these events. They usually don't invite me up to the big kids table. This is new. I'd like to say too, though, as far as we're in the process of seeking to amend the consent judgment that currently exists to incorporate initially the criteria changes, the drinking water criteria changes and other criteria changes. And we, the state, are basically on the same page as the interveners as far as remedial issues and stuff like that. I think we're getting close to the finish. I can't say how soon, but it's looking way sooner than any time before. And that is the point at which you'll get the transparency. You'll see what we've been doing, and then people can make decisions based upon those results. Thanks.
Could you talk a little about that process? Because one community here is not a partner, and each community has to vote on the consent. What is the process so everybody here understands what is happening as part of this consent decree discussion?
Well, what is going on is, you have the 4 interveners, the 3 local governments plus the Huron River Watershed Conservancy, and their lawyers are present, their technical people are present during the negotiations, and we're basically working on language for the revised consent judgment. And I know for sure that their lawyers are talking to their clients and are discussing what's going on as far as the negotiations and are keeping them informed. And once basically the lawyers all agree on the revised language, then it'll be time for the individual clients to make a determination of whether those results are acceptable. I don't know how actually the municipalities will actually do it, but I'm sure you guys do actually. I trust your lawyers have talked to you about how decisions will be made.
Can I ask you one more question? So and maybe each of the communities have to say this, but once you reach a tentative, are these elected officials able to share it with the communities that they represent before they vote on it? I'm asking all the questions you're asking me.
I don't know exactly the answer to that question, whether it can be shared before.
Yes. The answer is yes.
The answer is
Yes.
One of the lawyers just came up.
Okay.
All the electeds are saying yes.
Well,
I'm just getting everything out on the table tonight, because people ask me these questions. I'm not the lawyer at the AG's office, I'm not with the EPA, I'm not with EGLE, but I listen. God, I'm going to use a John Deagle phrase. You have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, which is to understand what people are asking. And this is one of the questions. Now, I'm going to ask if any of the elected officials want to make any comment. But we didn't introduce Joan. Did we introduce Joan?
No,
Very briefly, but I think.
You want to say something?
Yes.
We would welcome you saying something.
Hi, my name's Joan Tanaka, and Congresswoman Deagle, thank you for having us. We're delighted to be here. I have been working in the Superfund program for about 25 years, and I've primarily been working in the long-term cleanup program, and we are here just to answer any questions about that program. I will start off by saying that program by design is a sort of a cleanup program of last resort. That's the way the statute was written. Are there no other environmental, federal or state statutes that will solve an environmental problem? Is there no other means by which to solve an environmental problem? And you are of the magnitude and complexity that you qualify for the Superfund National Priorities List. So that's what we're about. And I just wanted people to understand that it is sort of, it is indeed a cleanup program of last resort. It also is a very thorough program because it does not, you are not eligible unless you are a large and complex site. It's a very thorough program, and it is also has very many steps. It's very deliberate, just to make people understand that if you do qualify for the Superfund National Priorities List and you do actually get on it, it is a very slow process that we go through to get to final cleanup. So those are some introductory remarks just to give you a platform from which to maybe ask other questions if you have them.
Do any of the elected officials, Jason's saying no? Okay, so Mike,
Yes, I think one of the questions you were
here
asking.
we've got the mic right there.
Okay. I think one of the questions you were asking is about the ability of jurisdictions that are not intervening in the lawsuit. Will we be able to see and understand what the result is before the county votes on this? It's my understanding from talking to a number of the county commissioners that once the language is decided in the consent judgment, that the county commissioners will be able to discuss it with the other jurisdictions in the county that are not interveners.
You agree with that?
Sounds okay to me.
I just, there are too many misunderstandings. I come out of too many meetings with, I don't want someone to say later, hey, you all, Ann Arbor Township, you can't hear about it because you're not up. So I'm standing up for you at this meeting. Anybody, Jack, did you want to?
No, I'm just listening to that train of thought.
Mr. Mayor, anybody there? Okay. So why don't we start with the elected officials? I know that some of the, and the lawyers had questions that they submitted, so, not submitted, but suggested. Do you want to start with some? I'm looking at Jason. You may not have wanted to, but.
I think our thought was that the questions we submitted, maybe there'd be a starting point to maybe answer some of those ones we already submitted, or do you want us to
I wanted you to ask them so everybody in the room knows.
Okay. Katie will grab a copy of those for me. I don't know.
Well, let me ask one of the questions while you're getting those, because this is one of the most frequently asked questions I get, which is, and I think it's very important that the four communities reach sort of, but if they decide to ask the governor to ask EPA to intervene, would EPA to intervene? Is that the...
Yeah, I mean, we had four primary questions that came from the attorneys initially, and so the first one was, if the governor requests that the EPA take over administration, regulation, response actions at the site under the Superfund process, will EPA do so?
So I can attempt to answer that for you. So, like I said earlier, the CERCLA National Priorities List, or NPL process, is the program of last resort when other programs are not successful. And it is also, we sort of get our business from our state partners. The states, of course, are much closer to the problems in their state, and they also have a better idea of what is a priority for us to consider for cleanup under the CERCLA NPL process. So, if EGLE would come to us and say, we would like for you to consider the site for the National Priorities List, the first thing we would do is look to see if there are other environmental work that's being done out there. And if there is other environmental work being done out there, and I will just point out that there is right now, then we likely would not proceed further. Like I said, it's the program of last resort. If that program is found unsuccessful, or if it gets sunsetted, and if Michigan comes to us and asks us to evaluate this, we would evaluate it.
So I'm going to have you answer that question a little more specifically, because I think everybody just heard in the room that EPA wouldn't take this as a Superfund site. And I don't think that's I think it's complicated, and I've spent a lot of time on this, so could you, the issue of one, that there's a consent decree there, but two, if EGLE were, and EGLE is trying to, and EGLE knows that they've got to work with this room and that they're, you know, people worry at times, but first, if EGLE, and nobody's made any decisions, I'm agnostic on this, it depends which hour of which day you're talking to me, I really want to say that. But if EGLE were to decide to ask you, that would mean that they probably were at a point that they thought you were the best option. Is that not true?
I think that's a good assumption, but, I mean, EGLE is right here, we can ask them.
Okay, who wants to?
Yeah, I would agree with Joan that, you know, we lay out the facts as we know them as far as what the situation is with the level of contamination and what we have in place for remediation, and we score it and then provide that information with our, you know, our assessment of that, and then EPA takes a look at that and they either concur or don't concur, and we move forward with the process.
So I want everybody to, I mean, I'm agnostic, but the EPA isn't saying they wouldn't take it. And EGLE wants to work with everybody, so, and I guess there's one other fact that I would put, it's not. When you did the preliminary assessment, like some people have said, is it even enough of a polluted site that it would be considered? And I believe on the preliminary assessment, we're allowed to say that. So why don't you?
So we were asked to look at the situation, the release. We call it a release because it's not a site yet, and under CERCLA it's not a site yet. And we look at it under a preliminary assessment, which is a very quick look. It also makes a lot of conservative assumptions that the contamination is bad. And we also did a quick score to look at it. And it would be eligible then to go to the next step to have us keep looking at it. So indicators are, at this juncture, that it would score. The scoring process, remember I said it's long and deliberate? Okay, so from the preliminary assessment, which is done, to actually getting just on the national priorities list to allow us to evaluate it would be a number of years. Okay, so preliminary assessment's been done. I actually have a pre-remedial coordinator if you really want to get into the details of what we have to do, but it would probably be about 3 more years before we would propose the site, and that is the timing of proposal is dictated by EPA headquarters. Sometimes they do it a couple times a year, sometimes they do it once a year. We really can't predict. Then you put it out for public comment. And then if the comments are substantial, it could take another year before it's final on the NPL. So that's the kind of time frame, you know, 3 + 1 that you're on. You can start looking at it as a Superfund site. It takes some time.
I'm going to ask another question down the road. I do want to just, I am agnostic as I make this observation, but it's every year that you are on another path, that's a year that EPA hasn't been. I'm not saying that, and I think EGLE needs to talk and answer a lot of the questions, because I think EGLE's trying to work hard too, and I want Mike to understand people's frustration here and how you get to the long-term plan and who's better. But what's your next?
So the next question was, if EPA does take over the site under CERCLA, will EPA require Gelman to take active response actions to prevent migration of dioxane at any detectable concentration, or alternatively anything above drinking water criteria into portions of aquifers that are currently not impacted?
So this is not going to be a satisfying answer, but we don't know the answer to that question. It's not big time on EPA's radar right now. We had a discussion with Michigan about whether they want us to proceed to do the NPL listing, and they expressed interest in pursuing the enforcement that they're working on right now. And so we said, fine. So we don't get into the details about the circumstance. So I don't have an answer to that question because we don't know enough technically about the site to say so. I will say that we will follow our process. We would follow our process. We would follow our deliberate, thorough process. We would be doing it in very close coordination with EGLE. And other than that, I really can't predict what we would be doing.
Let me ask before, would you answer that question if it stayed with EGLE?
Well, you know, we operate under Part 201, and then what really dictates the actions that go here are the consent judgment. So the implementation is dictated by that. So we oversee to make sure that the responsible party is doing what they're supposed to be doing.
So if it's not in the consent decree, I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot, but they're all going to ask me these questions.
I'm going to ask Jerry.
Sorry, so what is or isn't in the consent decree? What is, I'm sorry, I want to ask the question.
I think, Debbie, what you're asking is if...
I'm asking for you, but I want you to...
Well, yes, no, thank you. If something isn't in the consent decree, I think is, what level of cleanup would you have?
And it's comprehensive as what you asked for here. I don't have that in front of me, so that...
Oh, yeah, so basically, you know, what level of cleanup would there be under EGLE's actions as part of
But
consent?
the aquifers, the ones that aren't... Read the whole question.
So it was, if EPA does take over the site under CERCLA, will EPA require Gelman to take active response actions to prevent migration of dioxane at any detectable concentration, or alternatively, anything above drinking water criteria into portions of aquifers that are currently not impacted? So what
That
would
was
that
my
answer be
point.
under EGLE?
Well, under EGLE, the consent judgment dictates that that's not happening right now. It is allowed to migrate above the drinking water criteria.
If it's not in the drinking water.
And I think this question was initially thinking about under EPA. Oh, who's that? Under
Jeff Irwin, you'd know it was Jeff. I wanted them to know you were here.
Under EPA, what do you generally look for in terms of a criteria for cleanup standard? So that's what we're trying to get at is generally what would you be looking for, targeting for a cleanup standard with a site like this?
Is it a federal standard or a state standard under Part 201?
Okay. Again, I can tell you some of the parameters of the program, okay? So one of the constructs of the Superfund law actually is anything that the state would use and has the legal authority to use as a cleanup standard immediately becomes a cleanup standard for a CERCLA cleanup, for a Superfund cleanup. So that's one of the constructs of how we do cleanups. So it's going to be different. You know, in Michigan, they have their sets of cleanup standards. In Illinois, they have their sets of
Yeah,
cleanup
I
standards.
think, you know, if I could just add, and I don't know the answer to this, but I think the question that they're asking is, if the federal, say, limit for cleanup standard is more stringent than the states, which
Yeah,
you
that's
clean up to?
We would use the most stringent. Yeah.
So the federal, yeah, that Mike did a good job of summarizing that.
Thank you. I'll just finish these last two questions and then we can open it up to whoever has questions, but these are just the main ones we had initially. If EPA does take over the site under CERCLA, will EPA require Gelman to continue active remedial actions, pump and treat, or other active measures in already impacted areas of the aquifers until drinking water criteria are met?
Yeah, so that's my same very unsatisfying answer. It's really impossible to say. We understand that lots of stuff is going on right now with EGLE's enforcement with the responsible party. And if they sunset that work and you transition it over to some federal work, I think there's going to be a lot of talking. There's going to be a lot of talking between US EPA and EGLE and a lot of talking that also includes the responsible party. I don't think anybody wants the problems to get worse, right?
Right.
And so we would be working together to figure out how that transition would happen. But I could not predict the details of what that would look like.
So let me just I'm sort of listening to everybody, but if you were to go that way, and it takes 3 additional years of work to put it on the MPL list, EGLE and EPA would still be working together. And I'm not making any, I don't want any question I'm asking to look like I think that anything's an answer I'm trying to get. But EGLE would still be ensuring with EPA that the work that's being done now to keep it from spreading and be safe would still go on. Is that the right way to say it?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we're still operating with this consent judgment, which, ensures that the responsible party, what they have to do. Part of this negotiation that's going on is because some changing standards or regulations. So, that has to be folded in. That's why that's ongoing, right? So, yeah, we're not, this is what EGLE does as far as oversight of responsible parties and remediation actions. So our role doesn't change. In fact, even if it became a Superfund site, our role would not change significantly as far as our involvement in this. We still are involved and work with EPA on all the Superfund sites that are in the state.
And I'll make an observation that I've learned a lot more between working with you all, but the McLeod Steel site was designated this year on the MPL, and they started working on that a long time ago. But EGLE is a critical partner with EPA, and I talk to both of them regularly, and they have regular community meetings, and they really work on that site, and I know to be a team. And I respect the respect that they each have for each other.
Okay, I have one more question, then everybody can do whatever they need to. This is a longer one. If the governor petitions EPA for Superfund treatment, and if Gelman successfully gets the state court to stay the state court proceedings, which are EGLE's request to amend the CJ to address the drop from 85 to 7.2 parts per billion, so that the CJ in place is the third amended CJ, what would and could EGLE do if a drinking water well hits above 7.2 but below 85?
All right, so I'm going to take this question. So currently, the current CJ is set at 85, and the initial reason for the renegotiations was to lower it to 7.2. Prior to even that, the state passing the 7.2 standard, we did have a detection above 7.2, and Gelman did replace in an emergency fashion, provide emergency bottled water also to the county and the state. And we had hooked them up to municipal water. And Gelman did that on their own accord outside of the CJ, and our expectation would be that they would continue to do that.
I know that the mayor has a number of questions that we saw, so maybe I'll let you ask some of them. Again, as EPA has said to you, they can't answer a lot of the questions that you all have because they've got to do the work, and they're not doing the work because the state hasn't. So, but I think if you could do a general summary of what some of your questions are, that would be a good thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Congresswoman. Thank you very much, EPA folks, for being here, EGLE folks as well, and folks from the AG's office. We all very much appreciate that. Following up a little bit on Ms. Tompkins, your answer with respect to the listing on the site, you indicated that if the EPA came to the conclusion that there was active environmental work going on by another party, that listing would be denied. Then there was some effort to understand and clarify in order that if a request came forward, presumably it would come forward from EGLE or with EGLE's participation and consent. Would EGLE have to essentially take the position that the environmental work that's currently being done is inadequate in order for listing to occur? Or has ceased?
So, yeah, they would have to say that their environmental program is not working.
So they would have to say, our program is not working in order for listing to occur.
Is it not working, or, so I learned on the McLeod site that there weren't enough resources, that they needed additional resources. So would that
So if Eagle took the position that they needed, that what we're doing is inadequate to protect human health, we need federal resources, at that point, we could come in. You could consider coming in.
Yeah, so again, I'm listening to your question and I'm not sure I'm going to answer it, so
That's
help me
okay.
if I'm not. You are eligible to be considered for the Superfund National Priorities List if there are not other environmental statutes or even voluntary programs or the progress being made to achieve a goal at these complicated sites is not adequate, and that a record is of that nature.
Who determines adequacy?
I'm sorry?
Who determines adequacy?
Well, we work together with the state to make that determination. I'm looking at Nuria. She's giving me a nod.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, here's a reality. They cannot, the Eagle has to, she's not going to do it without Eagle telling, agreeing. And I think everybody's trying to figure out how to clean up the site. But EPA is not going to come in unless, or even think about coming in, unless the governor invites them to come in. I think that now is one of the issues that needs to come up, which might be a good time to do it, because as you're trying to do it, is what are the tools that EPA has, and what are their standards, and what are the tools that Eagle has, and what are their standards, and what is the difference between them as people try to determine what your question is, what is adequate cleanup of the site? Is that? So I think Eagle should take that first.
I'm sorry.
So if I understand that question right, it's are there different standards between EPA and what Eagle can enforce under, say, Part 201? You know, I think that's part of the question, right, which I thought we already answered to some extent.
I think that one of them, so this is one that I hear. So EPA's goal is to clean to a pristine. Yours is to clean to safe. Is that what we've heard?
The consent judgment dictates the toolbox that we have in enforcement on this case.
For Eagle.
For Eagle, correct. And I don't know what EPA standards are because that's not what we were looking at, right? We've been looking at our standards. And again, and I won't speak for EPA, but that's a process to come up with that number. So I don't know the difference between the two numbers because the other number hasn't been identified.
But you would be for, I'm not trying to put, this is just because I've been talking to everybody. So Jeff, do you want to?
Sure, but you have the mic, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, I don't know which one. I'm trying to make sure
I don't
we're
need a
answering
mic.
that question.
Sure, I guess the question that you're trying to get to is what standards, we hear the standard that Eagle would apply, that is to say, currently the consent judgment that's live, and then if a consent judgment is modified, the judgment, the number included in that standard, which is the present 7.2. To what standard would EPA require cleanup?
So you're asking, to what standard would US EPA clean up the groundwater?
Yes.
Okay, and again, it's impossible to say today what that would be. Again, our national contingency plan says that the expectation is that we will restore groundwater to its intended use. Okay, so that's an expectation, it's not a requirement. This is a drinking water aquifer, so the expectation would be to restore it to drinking water standards. Do we do that all the time? No, we don't. We also have to pick a remedy that is cost effective. There's all sorts of boxes we need to check when we select a remedy. So again, we have to get, and this is a big complex site, we have to get in there and evaluate what's out there in the way of contamination, what are the potential engineering solutions, and how do we check all those boxes for striking the balance of the right cleanup. But again, our rule says the expectation is we would restore it to drinking water. Essentially, this case would be drinking water standards. I absolutely cannot promise that would happen here. We just don't know. We haven't run the long, multi-year complicated process.
Understood. I've got, if I may, I have three questions, one with
Yeah.
respect to lead agency, one with respect to the role of political appointees, one with respect to timing. With respect to lead agency, my understanding is that, well, can EPA describe now whether it believes EPA would serve as lead agency on the site, if indeed it were listed as a site, or would EGLE remain lead agency?
So my understanding is that we have a responsible party here, a liable, viable. If you have a liable, viable, responsible party, and you're being cleaned up under CERCLA, then it's a federal cleanup. It's a federal enforcement relationship that we would strive to do under consent. Again, that's my assumption. That's what I've heard. I haven't
That's accurate.
looked at the data.
And let
I
me
mean,
ask
the
one other
information.
question. Right, someday Jeff may get this done, but the federal, I'm sounding like I'm just trying to answer questions that the federal government has the ability to go polluter pay, correct? So you would
Yeah,
have
absolutely. That's our number one
Does the
choice.
state have that in law?
Polluter is paying.
Nope.
The polluter is paying, but if, for starters, there are lots of rumors out there, but does the state require the polluter to pay?
Not
No.
unless Jeff Irwin's bill gets passed.
Yeah, that's my point, so
So
I'm
then,
just,
I kind of disagree. I mean, all the actions that are happening out there, absence of what we do on our own as EGLE, are funded by Gelman and are done by Gelman. So, I mean, there are some contingency funds that we have set aside that helps fund some of our work. And some of that work is to verify things or to otherwise ask for more things. But for all intents and purposes, it is still polluter pay. That is the consent judgment.
another question with respect to political appointees, one of the issues that, would be overriding, some concerns with respect to giving it over, to seeking EPA is that the lack of further participation on the part of local jurisdictions in the process. There's a certain measure of reliance and confidence in staff members and professional career persons in EPA. There is, political appointees come and go, and so that's a question. So I guess with respect to two issues, do political appointees have approval veto over MPL listing? And do political appointees have approved veto over remedies in the event of MPL listing?
Okay, so our administrator of EPA is a political appointee. So, yeah, he has a lot of ability to determine how we are implementing our program. Now, does that happen? I'm not sure I've ever known it to happen.
Fair enough.
let
Perfect.
me ask you, what's happening, look, I'm never going to defend the Trump EPA, but I am in one sense. What's happening to the Superfund program under this administration? Because everybody in this room, look, I mean, let's just be honest, you guys can't comment on that. So forget I make a political comment. Can I ask you what's happened to Superfund under this administration?
For the responsible party.
Increased funding and
I'm not sure.
increased stability,
I think we've been about flat with funding.
but they haven't cut the program.
No, not at all. Not at all.
And that's what people are worried about.
Oh, no, I do not, my understanding, I don't get into the big picture details about the funding, but, I think some people might, generally, it's been about flat.
Finally, with respect to timing, you mentioned 3 years to the proposal of MPL listing, perhaps a year for public comment and final listing. I'm assuming is that assuming, well, after we get to that 4-year period, how long before a remedy is articulated and implemented? And I guess I'd ask under two scenarios. One, the remedy, for the period of time if the polluter cooperates, and two, the period of time if the polluter has a house-by-house litigation strategy.
Right.
And by way of a supplemental, what happens during that intervening time with respect to the ongoing cleanup? Are we stuck with the 85, the old CJ in that context? Obviously, that's not a question for you. As you all are thinking through the timing on the listing and the remedy, I'd ask stateside folks to think through what happens during that intervening time.
Okay, so we don't know a ton about the site, okay? And there is a wide variety of timeframes on the Superfund process. So even the 3 years plus 1 year, that's a guess with a fair amount of error bars. And so let's pretend it's correct. 3 years, get to proposal, 1 year later, it's proposed. Then again, my understanding is we have a viable peer responsible party. We would probably take about a year to negotiate a study. Okay, so now we're at year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We are pretty successful in getting them agreed to do the studies. And then the study, this is, as I can tell from very little information from what I've heard about the site, it's pretty large, it's pretty complex. So it's going to be a long study. It's going to take years. A short investigative study would take about 2 years. Long ones can literally take decades, okay? Now, what we always try to do is to, once we sort of have the green light, a site's on the national priorities list, we try to solve as many problems as we can early. Because the earlier you solve these problems, the quicker, the easier it is to solve them. Groundwater, if you get going on it quicker, it's going to be a smaller problem than if you study it for 5 years. So we would look for opportunities to do interim cleanups. And so even if the study took 25 years, we would look for opportunities to do an actual, at least initiate a cleanup before that 25-year time frame. But we're talking big chunks of time. 3 years to proposal, 1 year to final, 1 year to negotiate a study, and then, it might take a year or two to find, this would be a good idea to do something quickly. So 3 plus 1 plus 1 plus 2, figure out we're going to do something quickly. It would take a year to design it. It would take another year to negotiate the cleanup with the responsible party, and it would then take some time to implement it. So you can see, like, the time adds up before you would even do an interim remedial cleanup measure. Time goes by, it just stacks up, it adds up. I will say that we have a wonderful provision of the Superfund law is if at any point in time people are getting hurt, right? Somebody is being exposed to something that is unacceptable, we can be out there tomorrow with the emergency part of the Superfund law. So we're deliberate and we're slow, but we also make sure no one's getting hurt while we are doing that very thorough job of cleaning up the complex sites. So does that help? So what and then it can take 2 to a decade and a half to do a study. It can then take a year or two to negotiate a final cleanup. It's going to take 30 years to clean up a site, and so all those years are stacking up.
Understanding that it will in all likelihood take a long, long time, but in terms of getting to...
There's 30 years of waiting.
That's
what you just said.
In terms of getting to start, it's...
Well, wait a minute, it doesn't, to start, I think the state should talk about what their timeline is, and they're talking...
I just want to, what I heard was 3 years for listing, yay or nay, 1 year for public comment on that, which is then going to get to the final, 1 year to negotiate the study, 2 to X to conduct
if you
the
could
study.
find something to do quickly, a cleanup to do quickly.
And then it's...
Then you would, negotiate another year for the cleanup, and you'd probably get the design done pretty quickly, and then actually implement the interim
So
cleanup.
on the short, if we're assuming short, is
It's still
7 years before we're pumping? Is it 10 years before we're pumping? Is it
could
15?
be. It's just hard to say.
Sure.
Yeah.
If I were to say 10, you'd say that could be. If I were to say
Yeah.
5, you'd say no way. If I were to say 20, you'd say it could, but that's on the outside.
That's about right. Well, what do you got?
I just feel like it's hard to say. So when I was out here previously looking at data previously, that was doing it for the purpose of looking at whether or not anyone is exposed to levels that, pardon me, I was looking at the data for the purpose of determining is anyone being exposed to levels that pose an unacceptable risk, and the answer was no. I was not looking at it for remedy selection purposes. So though we've been out here and been somewhat involved in a very limited way, we haven't looked at those data to, for making decisions about how we would move forward if we ever were in that position of being the lead agency.
Yeah, I guess my point is we're not fast. We're really, really slow. And so, there's error bars on all these numbers I'm telling you. Frankly, I think what you said, to be a cleanup in 5, I don't see happening. Cleanup in 10, maybe, that's kind of the best guess I can give.
So before I give it to Jeff, does the state feel that they would be quicker? Is there, what I'm afraid of is everybody's going to run out of here and say, there's no way you can get, so I want people to be really realistic about what they're talking about, the short term, making sure there's not danger to anybody while we're trying to get to a final total cleanup as much as we can of this plume. Mike, and then I'll go to you, Jeff.
I'm probably going to give a similar unsatisfying answer. Right now we're held to what's in the consent judgment, which is not. It's designed to prevent the plume from expanding behind a prohibition zone, not to necessarily clean everything up to those standards.
So during the intervening time, we're at the third consent, we're at the 85 parts per billion current consent judgment activity.
I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, so under the current CJ, it's 85. And without an amended CJ, it would stay 85.
And so if there's no amended CJ and we seek listing, and we forsake and there is no new CJ, what's going to happen during this 3 years, 1 year, 2 years is
10
the
years.
Current CJ at 85 parts per billion is going to be implemented.
I can't speak to what Gelman would do, but they have already historically replaced wells that...
The best that would happen is that they
would continue to use the 7.2 number for risk assessments, even in the meantime.
Fair.
That would be what I would hope. But again, I can't speak for Gelman.
As to their obligation, it's 85.
Their obligation would stay 85.
But they have presently hewn to 7.2. Got it, thank you.
Correct.
But they don't have to.
I want to make something really clear because there's a lot of media in this room. And you can hear it at a high level, it's going to take 25 to 30 years to clean this site. And I can hear it from both sides. Everybody in this room at the government level is ensuring that this water is safe and you're working to not expand it. What can we tell people about what EGLE is doing right now so
We
that...
do not believe that there's any unacceptable exposures, and we continue to monitor that every day to verify that.
And if you, okay, now I'm about to go into what you're not allowed to talk about. But if you do get a consent decree, what kind of, is it the same kind of long time frame? Would it be, I don't know what you can say, but I think we need to say something to everybody because people need to understand reality. Is it going to get done sooner, another way? Is it going to take that, I just think that's a question everybody's got.
Are there any interim remedial measures that the EPA could take in the meantime while we're waiting for a remedy and a cleanup process? I think the concern that people have, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think the concern that people have, and I know a lot of my colleagues have, and a lot of residents have, is that we feel like it isn't, I know we're pumping and treating, but we feel like there isn't really a cleanup underway, that it's a prohibition kind of effort. We're keeping the people and the poison separate. And yes, it's not true that it hasn't violated the prohibition zone, because it has. And Gelman has, and the AG's office, and no offense, Mr. Daniel, has waived their actions in that case. So they have violated the prohibition zone. But inside of this prohibition zone, the numbers continue to go up. And they go up and they go up, and as the geology and the geography go down, it's popping out of the ground in our parks. And so at some point, there is going to be an exposure. And so the concern is that it really isn't a cleanup that's going on. It's just sort of an action that maintains the status quo under the numbers. It's a slow motion train wreck. Thank you, Vince. And so that's why we're here, and that's why we're thinking maybe we are at the end of the road, and maybe we do need, as you say, a last resort. And no offense to the folks at Eagle, but it's not a cleanup. It's not a cleanup when it's coming up in people's basements.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jeff, you had
It's
one
not a
last question.
cleanup.
Mike? Thanks.
The time estimates.
You got to turn that, sorry.
Time estimates, is it on now? Doesn't seem to
Did
be.
the lights come on?
Yeah, it's blinking at me, but I
Takes a
don't
second.
hear any.
Oh, there you go.
Mike, you're on.
The time estimates you've been giving are average estimates. They're estimates over a number of sites. This site has 30 years of history that's been collected and been assimilated to show what's been going on. And the reality of what's been going on is the pollution under the treatment by the Attorney General and whatever the name is of the then current state group continues to expand in every direction. It continues to be going up in terms of numbers. The amount of treated area, amount of water being treated by the polluter goes continually down. And the question is, that I think everybody is trying to focus on is, given the amount of significant data that is available to EPA, collected and assimilated per well, and so demonstrated for each area in our jurisdictions, is there not the possibility that EPA would be able, with all of that data having already been collected, to reach a decision about whether this is an EPA site that would be accepted if the governor makes that request? And are there not interim measures that could be taken, despite their assumption that nobody is being affected by this water? That's what they've been saying for years, but we did discover people were being affected by the water. In fact, while Michael was here. And so I think altogether, we're looking for the EPA to realize that this is an unusual site with a lot of data that they would ordinarily have to collect that's already been collected. Does that not affect the time frame for your decisions and the kind of measures, interim measures that you might be able to take?
I think so. Do you have any comments?
Well, perhaps. I mean, you know.
It's a lot. We got it all.
Well, and I think Michael's talked about this in the past, so our data has to be of certain quality before we're willing to use it. Perhaps. You know, it won't
It's all
hurt.
data that's been collected by the state and transmitted to us.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
been, if it's not reliable, that's the reason we should be here.
Does Eagle want to make any comments on this part of the discussion?
Data.
Quality of the data.
All the data, yeah, you're confident in that.
We have full confidence in the quality of the data that we're collecting. The CJ dictates a lot of that, so does how the business in general operates. You know, there's been a lot of requests from the public. Roger knows asking for significantly more information. So I'm somewhat surprised to hear that we think we have enough information, because that's not what we hear from stakeholders. And, you know, we continue to maintain that there are no unacceptable exposures.
Oh, Kathy.
I want to thank everyone for being here, and just the fact that we have the different parties here at the same table is a major step forward. And one of sort of the urban legends, I don't want to give any information from the consent judgment, but what we're hearing on the street is that if we were to apply for Superfund status, everyone else would just go away and nothing would happen for a decade. And I don't think that's true. And the fact that everyone's here, you're talking about teamwork. Could someone explain what the process would be? Because I feel like applying for Superfund status sends a very strong message to a multi-billion-dollar company that we are now serious about cleanup.
Yeah, let me try and answer that. You know, again, we're operating under this consent judgment, and just because we applied for NPL status with the EPA and their Superfund program doesn't mean that that changes. So, in all likelihood, you know, we would just continue doing what we're doing until, as Joan indicated, when they got to that point, there would be some negotiation with legal responsibilities that are already in place and how that handoff would transfer when they start doing the work. But yeah, no, we're not going to just, if that decision is made and we do a preliminary assessment and it's submitted to the EPA for evaluation, we're not going to just pack up and go. Nor is that going to happen with
In the case
under
of the current or new consent.
Correct, correct.
All right. I have a question, sort of piggybacking off what Jeff was asking about. Our current strategies are an institutional control of the prohibition zone, and I guess I'm curious, as a general policy, does EPA utilize prohibition zones? Would they be likely to expand the prohibition zone? Do you have strategies around this? I mean, because I think that there is a feeling that the prohibition zone has been kind of abused and not actually address the heart of the problem.
So again, it's impossible for me to say what we would do. I know that US EPA frequently uses what we call institutional controls as part of the package of our cleanup program. And so that's where we will put a control on the use of water so that no one gets hurt until such time that it becomes clean, or even as a long-term cleanup remedy that does happen on occasion. We don't use the term prohibition zones, so.
Yeah.
Institutional control. Yeah, it's in our toolbox.
Would it be kept in place? If you took
Yeah, I mean,
As long as the CJ is in place, the prohibition zone would remain because it's part of the consent judgment.
So if EPA takes over the site, the prohibition zone stays
Katie,
in
can you
place.
As,
put the mic back down?
what I'm trying to say is, it doesn't matter if EPA takes it or doesn't take it, until which point that the consent judgment is vacated, it still maintains that's the state standard for Gelman to follow.
Katie, Scott, I'm going to get to the, promise I'm going to get to the public.
Probably, it's not even, oh there, I was going to say I probably don't even need a mic if I use my nurse voice. So I have two questions, and they're probably both quick. So we have heard that the first thing that needs to happen is that the governor would ask EPA to consider the Gelman site as an NPL. But what I'm hearing today is there's actually another step, that the governor asks EPA, and then EPA asks EGLE.
No.
yeah,
Yes, what?
it's the same thing. We have to have an assurance from the state of Michigan that the governor's office supports listing.
And then you
So-
confer with EGLE about what's happening at the site.
And then if you're in the Superfund process, the Superfund law says every step of the way, we are working closely with our state partners.
Okay. Second question is, we've heard that EPA will come in swiftly if there is potential harm, and we've heard from people talking about the harm of 1,4-dioxane. I'm wondering if you have a number for us that you consider 1,4-dioxane as harmful to people? What, I mean, we know the drinking water standard is 7.2, and previously it was 85. What's the number you consider as harmful to people and you need to come in right away?
So if it was a Superfund site, there would be a process for figuring out what the number is. We do have, my understanding, and I'm not from the removal program, but my understanding is that if it's, what is it?
46 parts per billion.
If it's over 46 parts per billion and there's exposures at that level, we have the option to use that super quick removal cleanup authority that I referred to. Those numbers are posted, are published in a table.
For drinking water, 46,
Yeah.
or for like
For drinking
exposure
water.
to somebody puts their
Drinking.
toe in it?
Drinking water.
Drinking water, okay, thank you.
I want to ask one other question, which I got late today and keep kind of, which is, there was an article in Bridges about 2 weeks ago, or the beginning of the year, that said that there were 3 Superfund sites in Michigan that were not being taken care of, that the money wasn't there. And people are worried that even if this gets on the NPL list, it would not be, the timeline that you took. What?
In
They
30
will
years.
clean it in 30 years, she just told you.
Well, but I think we also need to understand what the state is saying. So, there's cleanup and there's making sure you all are safe. And it's been 30 years and the site's not cleaned up. So it's almost 40. But what is why is money put in some sites and some sites? Can you assure people? I guess people are worried about if they go to EPA, how do they even know if it does get put on the NPL that the money will be there to do ultimately what needs to do? Is that the right way?
You got it.
Okay. No, I know they got a responsible party, but I got to ask the question, and I'm putting everybody's.
$26 billion company.
Yeah, so our preference is always, we get most of our work done under the CERCLA law, Superfund law, by getting the viable, liable parties to do the work for us under the enforcement provisions of the law. If we don't have a liable, viable, responsible party, we do use taxpayer money. Those sites do queue up. We have more sites that need the money than we have the money. That's kind of always been the case. So, does that answer the question?
Is it based on
We got it.
danger, or prior?
Who gets money?
Yeah.
So, it's like a matrix decision-making that the regions get together and then headquarters weighs in as to who gets money. I don't know exactly how it happens, but certainly the greater the threat of risk, you're much more likely to get the money. I don't know what other factors they have.
You're the deputy director and you don't know?
I'm sorry, yes, that's true.
But I treat everybody with respect here, okay? There are questions that people cannot answer because there are a variety of factors that both sides can't.
I'd just add on to that answer, though, is that, as Joan said, our understanding is there's a viable party here. There's a liable party with money, and our goal would certainly be to have them pay for a cleanup were they ever in the Superfund program.
Okay, I have a question. I have a couple of questions about that liable party, Gelman. And I have a couple of questions about their involvement in this whole process. Do they have the right to challenge the listing of this site as a national priority site?
So yes, everybody in the public has the opportunity to comment on the package we put out, which establishes that it's eligible for being put on the NPL. Everybody in the public has an opportunity, so certainly Gelman would.
So just in a hearing, in an administrative hearing, is that typically the way it goes?
No, they would write in public comments, and then we would need to respond to those comments. Am I getting that right? Yeah.
60 days. All right. Could the responsible party delay the proceedings is what I'm really after.
That's always a possibility, yes.
Okay. So the next question I have is, does Gelman have any input into the selection of a remedy for the site?
So So our goal would be, remember my 3 years, then 1 year to get from proposal to final, then you negotiate for a study. Our goal is to get I assume Gelman's the responsible party, to get the responsible party to do that study. So that study defines the contamination and then evaluates options for cleaning it up. So they would be writing that study with EPA oversight. EPA makes the decision what the cleanup plan is. We make it in close coordination with our state partners, and we also take into consideration public input on our decision. We would propose our cleanup decision. You know, work closely with EGLE. You know, our goal is to get on board with them, saying this is the best decision. We present that to the public. So then Gelman would then, even though they wrote the study that puts out all the options, they would have the opportunity to comment on what we think is the right cleanup plan, as would everyone in the world, right, would also have that opportunity. But they do not pick the remedy, no. EPA picks the remedy.
General follow-up question about how the EPA might interface with EGLE. I was under the impression before tonight that the next step was for the governmental units to come together and potentially seek this letter of concurrence from the governor as the next step in going forward. But you're saying, as I understand it, that there has to be a degree of agreement with EGLE in this process. Could you clarify that just a little more, and then I have one more follow-up question.
Okay, so there's a couple things. Once we do all that work to establish that a site is eligible for the national priority list, we do that in close concert with our state partners. And in fact, we give them money to do a lot of that work, okay? Before we would take all that work they do and actually do the formal process of proposing it for the national priorities list, we have to hear from the state of Michigan that the governor's good with the listing. Does that help?
Yes,
Okay.
it does. I think that there's a public concern that some of the oversight hasn't been as good as people would have liked. I'll just leave it at that. And I'm wondering if, so what you're saying is EGLE wouldn't weigh in on whether or not you would actually get involved. It's the governor who would weigh in primarily on whether you would get involved.
I think I'll take this so I don't put and then let Mike add to that. So what they're saying, I went through this in McLeod, so I'll give you, and actually I didn't know that you guys were going to ask for, I was working with the local officials and then heard that EGLE did not have enough resources and they knew that they needed more. That's why I used those words. And so EGLE led the process of getting EPA involved. I think, I don't want to, I want to say this right. So I think that EGLE wants to be, I've spoken to Liesl, she respects the work that her team has been doing, but she wants to understand what everybody feels. And is this a fair thing to say? I think she cares about what the four communities say. She's going to work very closely with the governor, but I think I can also say the governor and the Attorney General's office, because as Dana, we all want to be on the same page, and we all care about what all four of you think. So we're all, the governor, EGLE, AG, and me, are trying to keep all the communities together. Is that a fair way to put it? And we all care about what you think. So none of us has expressed anything, getting all of you to work together, because part of the problem, quite frankly, has been the four communities or entities have not been together. And that creates problems in and of itself. Did I say that well? Okay. Did I do that okay?
Just another quick
Who's got that, Jane? Go ahead.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for being here. It's a great opportunity for us to ask these kinds of questions. So to follow up on the clarifying question that Gelman would have, again, input in the process. Gelman writes the study for EPA review. correct me if I'm wrong in my understanding, they have the right to challenge the inclusion of the site into the NPL. What input would, so right now, we're interveners, which is a huge step forward for us, so we can somewhat obligate Gelman to do certain things. So under this NPL setup, what input would local governments and other stakeholders have?
So in the study and the remedy selection process, you're asking?
Right.
Okay, sure. So we, I wish I had a lawyer here, but I don't think it's possible for a community to be part of that enforcement agreement between EPA and Gelman.
It is not.
The community is not a part of that enforcement agreement. What the statute does require is that we respond to the community needs vis-a-vis outreach and communication, and we'll do a site-specific community involvement plan, like right at the start, before we would kick off the remedial investigation. We would get. I mean, I can tell this is the community that would require a robust community involvement process.
That's an accurate assessment.
And we would respond to that. I mean, some communities we don't go out very often because they're not that interested, and some we go out regularly and update them about what's going on, and listen to their input, and but like an official place at the table of the enforcement, there's not a place for the community in that regard.
I'm gonna let you all, this is not a, if you'd ask your question respectfully, because you've been, so that you are able to ask your question. Katie, please. Then I'll come to you, Vince. But we're not giving, short and concise, please.
So I want to say that after 30 years that this plume has only been growing, it is difficult for us, Ms. Dingle, you asked us to show respect. And with all due respect, I find very little reason to respect this whole procedure and process. Because all I see is no cleanup, all I see is the plume growing, and all I see is a group of people who keep coming to these meetings and go out with absolutely nothing in their hands. I've been telling the public in Ann Arbor for a long time, at least a year, that this road to clean up by federal agencies, this road to Superfund is a dead end. At best, they can get around, even if you are on the list, it will take 30 years for them to clean it up. She cannot be any clearer than that. She is telling us every step, no, no, lots of time, no, no. So we have got to Ann Arbor to put the shovel in the ground and start cleaning it up right now. The other thing I want to say is, you say to us that 7.2 parts per billion is acceptable and it's clean. I tell you, in New York, there are hundreds of scientists who've sat around and written new regulations that say 1 part per billion. 7.2 is 7 times higher. So don't give us dirty water to drink. Put the shovels in the ground and clean it up right now. We don't need the EPA to tell us maybe at some point 30 years we'll clean it up. We should clean it up right now. It is our responsibility. We dirtied it up. We allowed it to get this large. It's our responsibility to clean it.
Okay, Vince?
I don't need anybody to clap for me. Just think about it yourselves.
Hi, Vince Caruso. I'm with the CARD, founding member, board member of the CARD group that's been following this. It's collected a lot of data over the last 30 years. Roger Rayle's got tremendous amount of information on maps and various things. So this is one of the compounds that was selected in the Lautenberg Act of 2016. Of all the thousands of chemicals they could have picked, this was one of the 10 that was picked to be evaluated for the new chemical list for EPA. We have a situation now where the CARD group has been clamoring for tests and evaluations of near-surface exposures. It took many, many months, I think it was in 2 years, to get some minimal tests done which showed now we have 22 part per billion at the surface in a park on the west side of the city. In an area, we have lots and lots of wet basements. So we have basements that are going to be exposed with this compound, leaching into the basement, evaporating. It's a little bit strange vapor intrusion situation. We have someone at the University of Michigan who's trying to work with us. My wife's a toxicologist. One of her colleagues is looking at doing tests on this. But our concern is that EGLE has not been due diligent. This is a compound that's now at the surface. The prohibition zone isn't protective. Most people would say if it's percolating into people's basements. We need, I think, better and more robust cleanup. And Debbie Stabenow, our senator from Michigan, told me at a meeting less than 2 years ago that if there's a responsible party, EPA is doing cleanups. We're doing cleanups all over the country with responsible parties. This is a $25 billion company, Danaher, that bought Gelman. That's a responsible party. We should be looking to that responsible party to do a cleanup and not allow this compound to be percolating through the city with hundreds and hundreds of homes at risk. We have wells that are near the prohibition zone that are being, every day the plume moves farther outside the prohibition zone. It's moving north, south, east, west, every direction. Totally unexpected by the officials.
It's in the drain.
But we need, I think people are going to say, we need more professional help. We need the money from the polluter to help clean this up.
Well, does anybody want to comment on that before we go to the EPA or EGLE?
We have continued to, and we have done before, shallow groundwater investigation in that area, and we have not found it in the shallow groundwater. The 22 that's being referenced was actually, it's in the pipe, in the Allen Creek pipe. We are looking at that issue, and that's about all I can say specifically because it treads into the renegotiation.
It's in the groundwater.
The testing that we have shows that 22 was in the pipe. And subsequent or prior surface water sampling, shallow groundwater sampling that we did not show it.
Except that it did show it, but not, it did show it, but not in West Park area. Close to where we...
That site is picking up tremendous amounts of groundwater. Within a drought, we asked you to do these tests in a drought, and you did that, to your credit.
22 is in the pipe.
But when you're standing over that grate that you tested, that's 10 feet down, there's water gushing through there at huge volumes during a drought. That's all groundwater that's being picked up by design. The city of Ann Arbor designed that pipe to capture groundwater because basements were being undermined and the street was being undermined. So that probably in all likelihood is groundwater, and it's percolating all through the west side now, and it's going up. It's been going up. Every test we've done in the last couple of years has gone up. It's up to 22 part per billion. We have a scientist in our group that's talking maybe 100 part per billion as an action level. And we would like to see more professional analysis and more effective management of this site. And I don't think we're getting that from the state. I don't think, not to, be critical of EGLE, they're a state facility. I think EPA has much more standing. They have the ability to go after Danaher, which I don't think the state is going to do or can do. And I think that's one of the remedies that we have. I think that has the best chance.
Thank you, Vince.
Hi, yes, I'm Rita Locke Caruso, and my question is really for the lawyers, and it's about the consent judgment, which to me does not seem to have really solved anything. It did initiate some cleanup, pumping and treating, but as it's been said, we've pumped and treated more dioxane than we thought was there originally, and it just allows the plume to keep spreading. So my question is, and it seems like from Googling it that it is possible to make a consent judgment go away. And so I wonder, is there any advantage to keeping the consent judgment? What would it take to make it go away and let regulatory agencies make decisions about this cleanup without a judge and lawyers being the negotiators of what happens.
That's all yours.
It's all mine, and sorry, Rita, I can't give you an answer. It would be largely speculative at this point.
That's my frustration.
I understand, I understand.
In order, Mr. Burkhoff, I noted that you have AV materials about the Superfund process.
Sure.
And although I think I have a general sense and a much better sense of the process now, it might be useful for what I imagined was going to be a short but awesome tutorial about the process to be given voice. Thank you.
Oh, Joan, if you want to.
Yeah, I'll do it. So,
Would you mind standing over here so that people on the
I'll give you the handheld. Where do you want me to stand?
Just in the corner maybe, so everyone.
Oh, okay, I got it.
Yeah, sorry, we didn't
I'll appreciate it.
we didn't realize it would be so many people. We did. I would have brought a projection, although we probably have one. All right, so this is where I was talking about. We've done a preliminary assessment. So to get to the NPL, actual NPL listing, that takes, we're going to probably need another 3 more years to do more.
Can't hear you.
To do more work to establish that it's eligible for the national priority list. Then we would propose it. There'd be a public comment process, and then we finalize it. So about 4 years here, big error bars, can't guarantee how long it would take. So then we have an NPL listing. This is also where everybody has the opportunity to say, you didn't do your listing package right. This isn't eligible for the national priority list. Or you can also say, oh, this is awesome. We want this. You know, you can comment however you want on our proposed list. Then we do what's called a remedial investigation and a feasibility study. This can take, at a small, easy site, it can take 2 years. At a large, complex site, it can take decades, okay? And that's where we determine where all the contamination is, what risk it is presenting to the environment and to the public, and then what do we need to do to clean it up? That's an engineering study. That's called a feasibility study. Then we do what we call the record of decision. It's EPA's decision-making. What is the right thing to do to provide the necessary protection here? And that's an administrative process, can take about a year. So again, the remedial investigation feasibility study can take 2 years. It can take 30 years. 30 is a long time for a remedial investigation feasibility study. And again, in this process, we would look for opportunities to do things as quickly as we can. And we will oftentimes do 1 or 2 or 3 or even 4 iterations of determining the extent of contamination and cleaning up this part of the site first, then cleaning up that part of the site second. So, and then once we decide what we're going to do, that's when we enter into negotiations again with the responsible party to actually do the design and cleanup. It can take about a year. And I forgot to mention that between listing and doing the study, it can take about a year to negotiate with the responsible party to do the study. And then, designs, it's hard to say, depending on what the design is. Can take a year, can take 3 years. And then a long-term complete remedial action. Groundwater, contaminated groundwater sites often take a very long time to clean up. It's difficult to clean up groundwater. It's a slow process. A lot of times you have to do an iterative process to get it to the cleanup level you want to. So again, that could be decades when you're actually doing the construction. Okay. And then, yay, we've done all the work we need to do to put the remedy in place. We wait for all the cleanup goals to get achieved. And then we go through another public comment process with the concurrence of the state of Michigan that we're going to take it off the national priorities list. And then we've got a little reuse bubble up here, and I'm not sure it really applies here because this is a groundwater site. So we like to get all of our Superfund sites back into productive use in the community. So that's our process.
So can I ask, I don't know if it's going to be the AG's office or EGLE, to talk about their process and what their process is, because I think that I want to make sure everybody has a common understanding, and I know people are going to walk out and say EPA won't do this for 30 years, but we're talking about cleanup versus keeping people safe. Can one of you put this in perspective so everybody's putting it all in the same, I don't even know if I'm articulating this correctly.
Well, I may defer to Jerry here, but again, it's a risk base, and specifically, part of our criteria is exposure to drinking water is first and foremost, and then we're usually looking at ground contamination and risk of vapor intrusion type risks. Those are the first and foremost. But again, is like Joan said, whether or not we're doing a cleanup versus imposing institutional controls to contain it, and that is what the consent order has dictated, that they told us what we would do. So, I mean, at this point, this is what we have.
Michael,
Yeah, I was actually going to speak to the institutional control, so if you want to stay on this for a second.
well, what I want to, is that I want to make sure we're all talking on the same language. So the consent decree is very important, because that dictates what the state activities are. I don't know what they're talking about. Some of the rest of us in this room don't know what they're talking about. EPA's, if the consent decree says clean it up, then they're going to clean up the site versus managing the risks. EPA's goal is to ultimately clean up the site, because, I mean, is that, or to clean up the aquifer. I don't even know if I'm using.
That's our expectation.
That's their expectation or their goals. So I just, what you all working on this consent agreement have a lot of responsibility, because that's going to dictate what the state's activities are going to be. And part of where this all comes down is, can the consent decree with the state actually get this site to where you all as a community want it to be? Or do you want to, and it will take time, or do you want to get it into the consent decree that you want the site cleaned up? Or you've got the same, but that's what, I'm not in the room, I don't know what you're doing, but EPA has a more understandable where their long-term goal is, and I'm not saying EGLE's isn't, they can't talk about it. So I just want to make sure that people don't take the wrong takeaways. We're still in the business of trying to answer your questions, not make total assumptions here.
I think that maybe one way to show what the difference is in the power between the EPA and EGLE might be this. There's been some talk about the institutional control. And the institutional control here was one that was imposed by a judge. In fact, it was opposed by EGLE's predecessor. They did not want this institutional control. And it was based upon the notion presented by the polluter that this water would vent to the Huron River and go downstream and be a problem for somebody else. It was not gauged to create a cleanup. EGLE is saddled with this institutional control. It's the area that it was going to allow it to go under the city of Ann Arbor. So a lot of the pollution in the city of Ann Arbor is because of allowing this to go under the city of Ann Arbor at 2,800 parts per billion. And as I said, to make it somebody else's problem and not be our problem. As I said, EGLE is stuck with this. It's part of the consent judgment. Is it not possible, as an interim control, if EPA came in, to terminate that institutional control? It certainly is not gauged to cleanup. It's gauged to making it somebody else's problem.
Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, we can't say what we would do.
No, I'm not saying what. Could you?
They can't.
Oh.
They can't. They're stuck with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll let them speak for themselves whether they can or can't. We would have the opportunity to reevaluate that as an acceptable approach, yes.
Well, the lawyers can't comment, but I mean, Michael's right in that sense. As I've already stated, we're our oversight of what the responsible party does is dictated by the consent judgment.
Can I ask another loaded question? That everybody keeps asking me, and I'm trying to, so what happens if the polluter sells their business? Who's responsible? Is there still a responsible party? And do both of you have the ability to go after that? I know you guys are all asking me. I'm just taking all the questions you guys asked me. They ask me this a lot.
Gelman Inc. is the responsible party, the liable party. They're the corporate entity that is currently performing under the consent judgment and will continue to perform under it. And that's who EPA would be dealing with.
So if they spun off this site, they would still be responsible? He's not saying yes.
If Danaher bankrupts the corporate entity that they created to buy this polluted
This may be
asset.
one of the people that asked me
We
a lot.
don't, actually, I don't
It has
know,
nothing to do
we
with
don't know the corporate structure. Or at least I don't, yeah. So, but I know that Gelman Inc. is still existing corporate entity that is paying for the cleanups. It's not for the remedy. And that's really all I can say. I don't know what the contractual obligations are between parents and subs and all that. But,
You know, Kai. Enlighten us, Kai.
So I kind of promised everybody, Jason, I'm gonna go, that we wouldn't be here. I want to make sure the hot questions, Roger, if you've got anything, I don't want you to feel that you weren't given the opportunity. Jason has another question, and we've got 2 questions here, so.
Do you have an answer to that?
Danaher acquired Gelman, so is Danaher not the responsible party?
correct. I don't know the answer to that question for sure, but I can't imagine that, a large corporation in this day would not do this without adequate protection, for the rest of the corporation.
So I think one of the questions I think a lot of us are wondering as the electeds is the whole reason for this meeting was to try and get some more clarity around the EPA process and what you might do. Quite frankly, I think we had some more concrete answers in the past than we've had tonight. And I mean that with all due respect, and just saying that you've done some studying of this site. The preliminary assessment was done. And we really, really appreciate the answers that you've given, but is there any more certainty on, or clarity that you could give us in some of those answers in terms of what would happen in terms of timeline and cleanup based on the preliminary assessment that's been done? I'm sure you've perhaps read an article or 2 about the last year of this process. You know a whole lot about this site. Is there any more clarity you can give us to help us as we're trying to determine what we should be doing as public officials?
So, the four questions we received from the attorneys, I mean, if you got greater clarity than that, they were guessing, okay? So, yeah, I have nothing more to add, and I'm sorry it's disappointing to you.
And I do say thank you very much for being here. We still appreciate that. I just wanted to see if we could get as much clarity as we can.
Yeah. Okay, I'll come back. Let me get a couple more from the public. Oh, Roger. Okay.
So I'm Roger Rayle. I'm a chair of CARD and chair and co-founder of Residents for Safe Water. and I've been watching over this site for going on 27 years as a citizen volunteer. So I probably know more about this site than anybody else in the room, because I know the early days, and I have data that's not in the current database. Now, it's my understanding that EPA has the ability to make the polluter pay for all costs, including monitoring around the edge of the site. Currently, that's being paid for by taxpayers. The other thing is that the EPA has the ability to deal with recalcitrant polluters. You can take them to court, and if they don't agree to the plan that you come up with, you'll hire somebody to do the plan and then bill them. And it's my understanding in almost all cases, you've never lost a cost recovery case.
Oh, I'm not sure that's true. We're very successful.
You're very successful, let's put it that way.
Okay.
Now, Michael Burkhoff was in and did with the consultant, did a preliminary analysis review of the site and gave us a lot of information that was from the DEQ at the time, files that we had never seen before. And that, I learned something, even though after all these years, I learned some things from those initial documents. There's more documents than we know are out there that are not being considered. The EPA, in my understanding, would take all this documentation, not lose any of it, not set it aside, or file it away and not reference it. You look at the whole site. That's why it takes some time to review it. But some of the time frames you're talking about, I think when you said for the cleanup, that's not for the cleanup to get started. That's for the cleanup to be underway and maybe done. Because this site, we know where the dioxane is. We have a pretty good idea where it's going. We know where there's monitoring that should be done to find out where else it's going and how fast, and all these different layers. But the state does not have the ability, under the consent judgment, to make the polluter do this extra sampling. And I think that's, by reason enough, is for the EPA to come in. Plus, this is one of those forever compounds. We're talking about time frame on this. It's not going to be cleaned up in 25 years. Yet, that's the deadline that the state in secret agreed to with the company. What, 5 years ago or so, when they said, here's a letter of credit, $30 million, 30 years for this cleanup to be done. What's going to happen at the end of that time period? Well, Brian kind of hinted at it. The parent company is going to protect itself. They're going to declare the Gelman Sciences entity is going to declare bankruptcy, and any cleanup that's left is going to go back to the public if it's not an EPA site. So we're not talking about decisions like right now and exposures right now. We're talking about what's going to happen 10, 20, 30, 100 years from now. Because this is the largest dioxane site of its type in the country. There's another one I just found out that's a little bit bigger, and they have a cleanup timeline agreed to of 110 years. So I hope that everybody who's involved in this does their homework and gets up to speed as quickly as possible so that we can get these questions answered and get on with the cleanup. So thank you.
I mean, a couple over here.
Hi, I'm Bill Shakora. I had a question and comment about the consent judgment. The consent judgment obviously restricts what EGLE can do, but if EPA came in, they would not be restricted by the consent judgment. And it seems to me there's a opportunity, just negotiating leverage, that the NPL listing, the threat of an NPL listing could give EGLE negotiating leverage to say, basically, you take the consent judgment that Eagle wants, or you get no consent judgment at all. And I'm actually an environmental lawyer. If I represented Gelman, I would take the consent judgment that Eagle wants.
They're not going to comment.
I know, that's why I said.
Let me, there were a couple over here. Katie, please. Oh, thank you, Kelly.
I'd like to just get a little more clarification on what would actually constitute a harmful action that would trigger earlier action by the EPA.
So it would be direct unacceptable exposures of the contaminant. So at a certain concentration, people are actually already drinking it, would be a good example of it.
So it would have to hit our water supply in order for something like that to...
That would be one way. I mean, if there's a residential well that gets contaminated above certain levels, we can use out those emergency removal cleanup authorities.
Just for that area or for the intent, would it trigger
Just who's ever exposed. Yeah.
And can you give us an example of maybe some sort of comparable site? I know I don't want to respect what Roger had to say about ours being larger and perhaps more complex, but about what kinds of actions were taken and you have some sort of sense of, okay, this is a goal, but it's an expectation, but not necessarily reality. So can you give us a sense of what reality looks like?
Well, I'm not sure we have a dioxane site like this. Yeah, I'm not familiar with a dioxane site like this, okay? But we do have lots of very large contaminated groundwater sites. So it's usually an iterative process. You'll do source control first. What's getting from a building or a drum or soil and the most concentrated stuff. That's what we'll want to pick up first because stop the bleeding. And that's not a groundwater action, but that's a source control action. And then we usually try to do a capture system for the most contaminated groundwater. Sometimes you can pump and treat it. Sometimes you can, different types of treatments. Sometimes you can squirt in a substrate that breaks it down into something that's not toxic. And so the hardest part of all our groundwater problems is the most dilute stuff that's in the biggest part of the plume. And there we will put in an institutional control and conceivably let it dilute out over time, assuming everything is safe. A lot of times we have science that shows if you add different types of substrates, that will also break down to something less toxic over time. But that's what I meant about sort of the iterative process of addressing these groundwater plumes. Again, neither Michael nor I can think of a dioxane plume of this magnitude in our region. No. So I don't have anything more specific than that.
There's one narrative that exists in the community that I've questioned this is if the EPA comes in, then all of a sudden, magic and there's a lot of work. And then there's, we get to drinking water standards or we get to, to purity. And I think it's helpful to hear about real life examples so that we can have we're just trying to get realistic expectations about what the trade-offs are on both sides so that we can make the best decision for our community. And so I appreciate your examples.
Okay, great.
So one thing, I do think it's really important that people understand that EPA has federal goals and that ultimately they're trying to, I know this site can never be pristine, but that's their goal. Where here, it's or keeping it safe. What they're going to do is make sure that everybody's safe, but is it under the consent decree right now, and I have no idea that yours is not. It's to manage the risk. It's not to clean up and even if you were to do that, it would take a significant period of time. So I really do want to make sure that everybody's both, who's ever managed it, and they're going to be managing it together, that ultimate cleanup of the plume is going to take time, period. And whether you're gonna try to clean up the plume and keep, or just keep it, you know, I was gonna ask this question. Are we just trying to keep it from spreading, or are we trying to clean it up? And I know you can't tell me because it's part of the consent decree, but I think that's what the community wants to know.
When I just heard EPA and say on this, and this gets, I think, to the remedy question that we're all kind of asking, if everything is safe, we'll let it dilute out.
I mean, again, I cannot tell you what the remedy is going to be. She asked me, when we have large, complex groundwater sites, what have we done in the past? Okay?
And one of those potential remedies, if there's not exposure above EPA acceptable limits, is...
If it's not above EPA acceptable limits, we're done, right? Then we've achieved our goal. We're going to walk away at that
if
point.
there's not, so you're focused on the limit, that's not the, I guess it's what did you mean by if everyone is safe? Are you referring just to the contact, to human contact?
So she asked me two questions. I think the first one was, when do you call in those emergency removal people? And so that was a separate question. You call in the emergency removal people when somebody is currently exposed to something unacceptable. So they're drinking it now, and it's above what we think is safe. We will get out there very quickly. It's really impressive. The second question she asked me is not related to the first question. The second question is, when you have, as I understood it, when you have a large, complex groundwater plume where you've made the decision that you want to clean it up, how would you do it? Okay, so that's what we've done in the past. We haven't looked at this large groundwater plume. We haven't decided what we're going to do with it. So so don't say, I think it's very dangerous to say, oh, we're going to do what I answered there at Gelman. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So, the aquifer that has been poisoned by dioxane used to provide the drinking water for the city of Ann Arbor. And the city of Ann Arbor was able to shut down its well because it had an alternate source of water. If that source, the Huron River, became contaminated with a substance that the city could not remove, so that the city was forced to be providing contaminated water with something, it might be dioxane, it might be something else, to its residents, would that change your approach to the aquifer at that point?
Or if our makeup wells that we had to go to become contaminated, and we need a mix of well and surface waters for
Right.
water treatment.
Yeah, we look at everything. Am I on? Yeah. We look at everything. We look at where the contamination is. That's why it takes so long. So where the contamination is, who's using it where is it going to. Again, the expectation is that we would restore the aquifer to its intended use. That's not a promise that would happen. A lot of times it doesn't happen. You can't do it cost effectively. We would look at all these puzzle pieces, and we would move forward with a remedy selection that, like I said, checks all those boxes that we have to check when we are making a remedy selection decision. One very important one is it cost effective. Another one is not negotiable is is a protective remedy. So the reason it takes so long is because these things are not easy to figure out, and we would look at that. We would look at what's going into the Huron River. If it's contamination from the site and it's going somewhere or it's already there, we will look at that, and we will try to figure out what's the best thing to do for the long term. I don't know what those things will be.
And if you all want that as a goal, which is why I think it's all very important that the 4 communities decide what their goal is, EPA, you could also put that into your consent decree with what I have no idea what you're talking about, but you all need to decide what is it you want. What are the standards? What's your ultimate goal? And put it in the consent decree, and if people won't agree to the consent decree, then you got to figure out how, does it matter? If we're not going to get there, how else do you get there? I don't know what you're doing, but I know that, and we got 5 minutes left.
Okay, actually, this is a good follow-up to what you've just said. My question is really to the governmental units, county and city and township, about what's the sticking point here? I mean, you started out with these meetings, what, a year ago or something, where you have asked them to come up with a unified decision, and every time we have a meeting, it gets put off more and more. And what actually is the sticking point? Is it a disagreement about the level of certainty you want? Is it a disagreement among your respective lawyers? Is it something else? But I'm wondering if you need to take a look at your decision-making process.
I'm not part of that decision-making process.
I know, I'm not blaming you.
But I do think now that they're in negotiations. I want to say that, and everybody's deaf.
I'll say what my holdup is.
There's a microphone.
My holdup is that I'm negotiating on behalf of my residents by proxy. I'm not in that room. None of us are in the room with the lawyers, with Gelman, with Mike Caldwell, who's been milking this for 25 years. Sorry.
But we're not assaulting anybody.
No, I'm not. I know Mike. And I'm not, we're not in there. We're negotiating by proxy. We don't know what's going on in that room.
So has anybody got a hot?
I got a couple questions. I represent the fifth ward where this institutional control is below. When we talk about geofencing, the Superfund site, are we talking about this institutional boundary, or are we talking about the contamination source? What are we talking about there when we just designate it as a Superfund site? Is it the aquifer that is also the Superfund, or is it the source contamination? And you talked about it a little bit earlier, about going and getting the lowest hanging fruit first. And that's the frustration for folks that I represent, is that it's still bleeding, it's still spreading, it's still there almost 40 years later. And that's just unacceptable. And so are we talking about containment, or are we talking about cleanup? Those are two different things. And the type of payment, the motivation of polluter pay under this current scheme seems to be different here. The EPA looks at things more than what the state does. The state's only, it's almost like a voluntary at what pace they move at. And so that's another issue. At what pace are we doing the cleanup at? And the costs associated with that pace.
I want to piggyback off his question, because I'm in County District 9, which overlaps part of Ward 5, and also takes up a large part of my district. A kind of technical question about where the boundaries of the Superfund site would be, were it to be on the NPL. Is it just at the primary site, or is it everywhere that dioxane has migrated out to? Because some of the places in County District 9 are not at this that's not the site, that's Jason Maciejewski's district. But some of the actual hits on the dioxane are higher in my district than some closest to the site. So where is the Superfund site technically? So I think that piggybacks.
That was my question, actually. You elaborated on it, but yeah, thank you.
Okay,
so those are good questions, and I understand the frustration of the community when they're like not in the heart of the thickness of the contamination, because it is hard for us to prioritize that, but we don't. For a Superfund site, we look at whatever contamination has been released from what started it all. Okay, what was the source and where it has gone. And if it's gone someplace in a community where it's still not safe, but it's pretty dilute, we still consider that part of the site. So it's our responsibility to make a decision that makes sense for that part of where the release has happened, and make sure that it's a protective remedy is in place forever. Whatever that might be. So, and then, if it dilutes out such that it's not causing harm under very conservative assumptions, then that's not part of the site. It's just
So it's beyond the source contamination.
It's definitely it's wherever the contamination started and where it has gone that causes a potential threat if people were exposed to it.
I just want to ask a quick follow-up. It was my understanding, and you please tell me if this is right or not, that when you're talking about groundwater contamination, that's the Superfund site. And so if the aquifer under a home is contaminated, the home is not considered a Superfund site if it's not actually involved.
Right.
Okay.
And I'm going to start to, I got Kathy and Felicia, then I promised these poor people that we would, and I want people to be able to answer the question. And I want to defend EGLE before I go to these two questions. EGLE is doing what the consent decree tells them to do. So you all need to understand. If you're frustrated, you now have the power in your hands to get a consent decree that you want, that EGLE will make sure it's enforced. Is that a fair statement? So don't blame EGLE, look at yourselves. Okay.
So my question was to refer back to something that we were talking about at the beginning, and I just want to make sure I have some clarity around it. So when, if EGLE and the governor request for consideration for NPL, and you stated, Ms. Tanaka, that there needs to be a cease of any sort of remediation at that point for it to be considered. And what I'm wondering is, during that 3+1+1 years, if that means that EGLE can do nothing during that time, and at the same time that EPA isn't doing anything because they're going through their process. So then if we request for Superfund, does that mean that there's going to be a time, maybe 5 years, maybe a decade, where nothing is happening?
Yeah, I don't think that would be likely. I think that we would work with EGLE. And, oh, do you want to take this, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I thought we answered that question. Again, our assumption is that the consent judgment would still be in place. We'd be operating as we're operating now with our treatment systems that we have in place now. And as the assessment was going on with the EPA, so they could get their plan together, that we wouldn't just vacate everything and shut down all the equipment. We would continue to operate. And then once they got to that point, then depending on what was still in place legally, that would have to be renegotiated or go to the courts.
Yeah, we would have like a legal handoff and a
Right.
technical coordination.
I just wanted to make sure, because you said that there had to be a stop.
Right.
And so I wanted to make sure that that stop wasn't years.
Right.
No, and again, once you get into these Superfund sites, like the EPA has already indicated here, they work with EGLE and our Superfund section. I mean, on all sorts of things. It's not like it's theirs, not ours. These are kind of funding sources and capabilities that change to some extent, but it's we don't just leave.
Okay, Kathy gets the last question.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And I just want to verify the assumption that I have, and this gets back to what Roger Rayle said, and thank you, Roger Rayle, for everything you've done for decades, is that an EPA Superfund site is a strategic solution. It's sort of a long-term insurance policy, and it does not negatively impact the short-term work that EGLE would be doing. So it's not a either or, it's a collaborative process.
Yeah, that's what Mike.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
that's exactly right.
Okay.
So I want to thank everybody from this panel who came in to be here. EGLE, which is trying to work with everybody, the AG's office that doesn't let us talk to each other. I said that with love. And all of the elected officials and the community. People do care. We got to work together, and we got to get this resolved. So remember, united we stand, divided we fall. So it seems to be what I say about everything these days in this country. But we all want to see this plume cleaned up. We all want everybody to be safe. We want the drinking water to be safe. And we got to remember, we're all working towards that goal. So thank you, everybody, for being here. And hopefully we will get together soon. Thank you.
Nice to see you, Mike. Thanks for your smart questions. Good for you.
Thank you, Debbie, for putting this together. Yeah. Thank you, Joan, for attending, for putting up with this guy.
Thank you guys. Thanks for
Look
coming.
great. Good. A lot of good questions.
It's a reason we brought it. You're all good.